December 1941, Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before a map of the Pacific, contemplating the attack he had just ordered on Pearl Harbor. A staff officer, buoyed by the successful strike, spoke enthusiastically about Japan's victories to come. Yamamoto cut him off with words that would prove prophetic. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto understood something many Japanese leaders didn't. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington. He had seen American factories, American highways, American oil fields. He knew that Japan's military advantages, better trained pilots, superior tactics, combat experience, would be temporary. Once America's industrial capacity turned toward war production, the mathematical inevitability of Japan's defeat would become apparent. Across the Atlantic, German leaders made similar miscalculations. They had watched America struggle through the Depression. They had seen American military unpreparedness in 1940 and 1941. They dismissed American industrial capacity as suited for consumer goods but inadequate for modern military equipment. German engineers believed their technically sophisticated weapons couldn't be mass-produced with American methods. They were certain that quality would triumph over quantity. Within 3 years, both nations would confront the reality of their miscalculation. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American shipyards were launching aircraft carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. American factories were building bombers at rates that made German air defenses irrelevant. American industrial capacity had been transformed into a weapon more devastating than any bomb or bullet. This is the story of how America outproduced the entire Axis, not through superior technology or better workers, but through systematic application of industrial methods that transformed warfare into a production problem. By the time Axis leaders understood what they were facing, it was already too late. To understand American industrial mobilization, you must understand what existed before Pearl Harbor. In 1939, the United States military ranked 18th in the world by size, behind Romania. The Army had 174,000 men, equipped with weapons largely left over from World War I. The Navy was substantial but obsolescent, with battleships designed in the 1910s. The Army Air Corps had fewer than 2,000 combat aircraft, most of which would be considered obsolete within 2 years. American industry in 1939 was focused almost entirely on civilian production. The automobile industry built cars. Steel mills produced for construction and consumer goods. Aircraft factories made civilian transports and a handful of military planes. The infrastructure, workforce, and supply chains were all optimized for peacetime civilian economy. Converting this to military production would require fundamental restructuring. The scale of the challenge was unprecedented. Military production requires different materials, different tolerances, different supply chains than civilian goods. An automobile factory couldn't simply start building tanks without extensive retooling. Aircraft production required precision manufacturing that few American factories possessed. Shipbuilding needed to scale up by orders of magnitude. And all of this had to be done while maintaining enough civilian production to sustain the economy. President Roosevelt understood the challenge earlier than most. In May 1940, watching Germany's conquest of France, he called for production of 50,000 aircraft per year. Military planners thought the number was impossible. Industry leaders said the factories didn't exist. Isolationists said it was warmongering. Roosevelt insisted. The goal seemed absurd. By 1944, America was producing over 96,000 aircraft annually, nearly double Roosevelt's impossible target. The transformation began before Pearl Harbor. The Lend-Lease program, enacted in March 1941, began channeling American production to Britain and later the Soviet Union. This served dual purpose. It supported allies fighting the Axis, and it forced American industry to begin retooling for military production. Factories building trucks for Britain gained experience that would prove invaluable when building trucks for the American military. But full mobilization required more than government contracts. It required systematic reconstruction of how American industry operated. In January 1942, Roosevelt created the War Production Board with authority to control industrial production, allocate materials, and direct the entire economy toward war production. The power was unprecedented in American peacetime history. The board could tell any factory what to produce, could restrict civilian goods, could redirect entire industries. The automobile industry exemplified the transformation. In February 1942, civilian automobile production ceased entirely. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and other manufacturers converted their assembly lines to military production. The last civilian car rolled off assembly lines on February 10, 1942. For the next 3.5 years, these factories would produce tanks, aircraft engines, jeeps, trucks, and weapons instead of cars. The conversion was completed in months, a speed that seemed impossible but proved achievable. Ford's Willow Run plant demonstrated what American mass production could achieve. The factory, built in 1942 specifically to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, was the largest room under one roof in the world, 3.5 million square feet. At peak production, Willow Run delivered one complete B-24 every 63 minutes. The bombers came off the assembly line with the same efficiency Ford applied to automobiles, a technique that German manufacturers considered impossible for complex aircraft. The numbers from Willow Run alone are staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, this single factory produced 8,685 B-24 bombers. Each aircraft required 1.2 million parts, 360,000 rivets, and 13,500 man-hours to assemble. At peak employment, Willow Run operated with 42,000 workers across 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The production rate was something no other nation could match. Germany's entire bomber production for 1944 was approximately 3,000 aircraft. Willow Run alone produced nearly 3 times that many 4-engine heavy bombers. But aircraft production was just one dimension of American output. Shipbuilding demonstrated even more dramatic results. In 1939, American shipyards were launching about 100,000 tons of shipping annually. By 1943, they were launching 10 million tons, a 100-fold increase in 4 years. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American production philosophy. These cargo ships, built to simple standardized designs, could be produced in extraordinary quantities. Henry Kaiser's shipyards revolutionized maritime construction. Before the war, building a cargo ship took about a year. Kaiser applied assembly line techniques to shipbuilding, using prefabricated sections that could be welded together. The time from keel laying to launch dropped to 70 days, then 30, then an astonishing 14 days for the record-setting SS Robert E. Peary. The ship that took 2 weeks to build wasn't a prototype or exception. By 1943, Kaiser's yards were averaging under 30 days per Liberty ship. The production totals are difficult to comprehend. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards delivered 2,710 Liberty ships. These weren't small vessels. Each displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded and could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. American shipyards also produced hundreds of tankers, attack transports, and naval auxiliary vessels. The merchant marine fleet that barely existed in 1941 became the largest in human history by 1945. And this was parallel to naval construction: aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, that made the U.S. Navy larger than all other navies combined. The escort carrier program demonstrated American production capability even more starkly. These small aircraft carriers, converted from merchant ship hulls, could be built in 3 months. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard delivered the first escort carrier, USS Casablanca, in April 1943. By July 1944, the shipyard had delivered 50 escort carriers, one every 8 days on average. Japan, which began the war with superiority in carriers, couldn't replace losses. America was building carriers faster than Japan could sink them, faster even than they could train pilots to fly from them. Tank production followed similar patterns. The M4 Sherman tank exemplified American production philosophy. It wasn't the best tank of the war. German Panthers and Tigers had superior guns and armor, but the Sherman was designed for mass production and reliability. It used a radial aircraft engine, of which America had vast production capacity. It was relatively simple to build and maintain, and crucially, it could be produced in staggering numbers. American factories produced 49,234 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945. For comparison, Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,300 Tigers total during the entire war. The numerical disparity was intentional. American doctrine accepted that individual Shermans were inferior to German heavy tanks. But if American factories could produce 5 Shermans for every German Panther, and if those Shermans were more reliable and easier to maintain, the numerical advantage would overwhelm qualitative superiority. And that's exactly what happened. The production wasn't just quantity. It was quantity with logistical support. Each Sherman tank required ammunition, spare parts, fuel, and maintenance equipment. American logistics provided all of this in abundance. German tanks might be superior technically, but they frequently sat immobilized for lack of fuel or spare parts. American tanks might be inferior individually, but they were almost always operational because supply chains kept them fueled, armed, and maintained. Artillery production demonstrated similar disparities. The United States produced over 250,000 artillery pieces during the war, more than Germany and Japan combined. The famous 105 howitzer that equipped American infantry divisions was produced in such quantities that ammunition supply, not gun availability, was the limiting factor. American artillery doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower, and American industry made that doctrine feasible. Small arms production showed the same pattern. The M1 Garand rifle, issued to every American infantryman, required sophisticated manufacturing, but was produced in quantities exceeding 5.4 million. Germany, with a larger army, produced about 14 million Kar 98K rifles during the entire war. Impressive, until you realize they were arming twice as many soldiers over a longer period. American production per capita and per factory was consistently higher than Axis equivalents. But perhaps the most significant American production advantage was in trucks and vehicles. The United States produced 2.4 million military trucks during the war. The Soviet Union produced about 200,000. Germany produced approximately 350,000. This disparity in vehicle production created operational mobility advantages that were decisive. American and Soviet forces could move quickly because they had trucks to transport supplies and men. German forces increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport because they lacked vehicles. The Jeep became iconic, but its significance was more than symbolic. American factories produced 650,000 Jeeps, more than total German truck production. These weren't luxury items but essential military equipment that gave American forces tactical mobility German forces couldn't match. A German infantry division in 1944 had perhaps 1,500 vehicles. An American infantry division had over 3,000. The mobility advantage translated directly to operational effectiveness. The production of ammunition provides perhaps the starkest illustration of American industrial superiority. The United States produced 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war, enough to give every person on Earth at the time about 20 rounds. Artillery ammunition production exceeded 1 billion rounds. American forces could, and did, use ammunition lavishly because supply was effectively unlimited. German forces had to ration ammunition carefully because production couldn't meet demand. American explosive production, TNT, RDX, and other compounds, exceeded Axis production by similar margins. The United States produced about 2.5 million tons of explosives during the war. This supplied bombs, shells, grenades, demolitions, and torpedoes in quantities that made every other production statistic meaningful. A factory can produce shells, but without explosives to fill them, they're useless. American chemical industry produced explosives at scale that kept every other production line relevant. Aviation fuel production demonstrated American petroleum industry dominance. The United States produced approximately 7 billion barrels of oil during the war years. This dwarfed Axis production even before considering synthetic fuel programs. American aircraft could fly training missions lavishly because fuel was abundant. German and Japanese pilots received minimal flight training by 1944 because fuel shortages grounded training aircraft. The qualitative advantage Axis pilots held early in the war evaporated as undertrained pilots replaced combat losses. The aluminum industry's expansion was critical to aircraft production. Aluminum production in 1939 was about 165,000 tons annually. By 1943, it exceeded 920,000 tons, nearly a six-fold increase. This aluminum fed aircraft production, but also vehicles, landing craft, and countless other applications. Germany's aluminum production peaked at about 250,000 tons annually. Japan's was lower still. The disparity in aluminum meant Axis nations couldn't match American aircraft production, even if they had wanted to adopt American mass production methods. The rubber shortage provided the clearest test of American industrial adaptability. Natural rubber came from Southeast Asian plantations captured by Japan in early 1942. The United States went from importing 600,000 tons of rubber annually to having supplies cut off almost completely. German advances into rubber-producing regions hadn't created similar crisis because Germany had developed synthetic rubber. American industry had to create a synthetic rubber industry essentially from scratch. The synthetic rubber program succeeded spectacularly. By 1944, the United States was producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, more than it had imported in 1941. This fed production of tires for millions of vehicles, seals and gaskets for engines, insulation for wiring, and countless other applications. The program required building entire chemical plants, developing new processes, and training workers in technologies that barely existed in 1941. It was completed in under 3 years, an industrial achievement comparable to any weapons program. The workforce transformation was as significant as factory construction. In 1940, about 9 million Americans worked in manufacturing. By 1944, that number exceeded 17 million. The expansion wasn't just hiring more workers, it was fundamentally changing who worked in factories. Women entered industrial work in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became iconic, but represented millions of real women who built aircraft, welded ships, and assembled weapons. The training infrastructure required to skill this workforce was itself an industrial achievement. Aircraft production required precision work that most workers didn't know. Shipbuilding required welding techniques that hadn't been widely used before the war. Tank and vehicle production required machining skills that took time to develop. American industry created training programs that could take workers with no manufacturing experience and qualify them for complex work in weeks or months. Quality control was maintained despite rapid workforce expansion and accelerated production. American factories implemented systematic inspection procedures, statistical quality control methods, and testing protocols that caught defects before products reached military service. The reliability of American equipment, Sherman tanks that ran, aircraft engines that didn't fail, ships that didn't sink from structural flaws, reflected industrial quality management that Axis nations couldn't match while expanding production. The supply chain integration was extraordinary. Building a B-24 bomber required components from over 400 suppliers across the United States. Coordinating delivery of thousands of parts to arrive at Willow Run when needed, without excess inventory or delays, required logistics sophistication that was itself an innovation. American industry developed supply chain management techniques that would later revolutionize civilian manufacturing, but were pioneered under wartime pressure. The financial scale was staggering. The United States spent approximately $300 billion on the war, about $4 trillion in current dollars. This spending created a command economy where government direction allocated resources, but market mechanisms and private industry did the production. The hybrid approach avoided Soviet-style inefficiency while maintaining democratic and capitalist frameworks. It was, in effect, proof that industrial capitalism could mobilize as effectively as totalitarian systems when motivated. The geographic advantages mattered enormously. American industry was safe from bombing. Factories in Detroit, shipyards in California, aircraft plants in the Midwest operated without air raid disruptions. This allowed three-shift, 24-hour operations impossible in Germany or Japan where bombing forced dispersal and reduced efficiency. The immunity from attack meant American production could optimize for efficiency rather than survivability. Transportation infrastructure enabled the production. The United States had the world's most extensive railroad network, supplemented by highways that allowed truck transport. Raw materials could move from mines to factories, finished goods from factories to ports, with efficiency that Axis nations couldn't match. German industry struggled with rail networks disrupted by bombing. Japanese industry faced shipping losses that made moving materials between islands increasingly difficult. American internal transport was so reliable it was taken for granted. The innovation during wartime production was significant but often overlooked. Proximity fuses, which made anti-aircraft fire far more effective, were mass-produced using production techniques that didn't exist before the war. Radar systems went from laboratory curiosities to standard equipment. Landing craft for amphibious operations were designed and produced in quantities that enabled Pacific island hopping and European beach landings. Each innovation required not just invention but production scaling. The comparison to Axis production reveals the disparity starkly. Germany's aircraft production peaked at about 40,000 per year in 1944, impressive but half American output. Japan's peak was about 28,000 aircraft in 1944, less than a third of American production. When you consider that American aircraft were typically larger, more complex, and more heavily armed than Japanese equivalents, the production gap becomes even more significant. German tank production, often cited as sophisticated, never exceeded 6,000 vehicles annually. American tank production in 1943 alone was over 29,000 vehicles. The Germans built technically superior tanks, but couldn't build enough of them. American industry built adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers. The strategic impact of 49,000 Shermans versus 6,000 Panthers was decisive regardless of individual tank quality. Naval production showed the most dramatic disparities. Japan entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers and built 7 more during the war, losing 16 total to combat or accidents. The United States entered with 7 fleet carriers and built 141 carriers during the war, 24 fleet carriers and 117 escort carriers. The numerical advantage was so overwhelming that American carriers operated with impunity by 1944, simply because Japan had no carriers left to contest them. The submarine comparison was equally stark. Germany built about 1,150 U-boats during the war, creating the most serious threat to Allied shipping. The United States built about 200 fleet submarines for the Pacific. But American submarines were larger, had longer range, better torpedoes after fixing early problems, and more importantly, had unlimited fuel. Japanese merchant shipping was decimated not by numerical submarine superiority, but by operational persistence that unlimited fuel enabled. Merchant shipping construction showed the production disparity most clearly. American shipyards delivered about 5,000 merchant ships, totaling approximately 53 million tons during the war. Japan built about 4 million tons of merchant shipping during the same period, 1/13 as much. By 1945, Japan's merchant marine was functionally destroyed, unable to transport oil from the Dutch East Indies or food to the home islands. The economic blockade, enabled by submarine warfare and sustained by American production of submarines and torpedoes, was strangling Japan by war's end. The Axis nations understood they were losing the production war but couldn't close the gap. Albert Speer, German Minister of Armaments, implemented production reforms that increased German output substantially in 1943 and 1944. But even with impressive increases, German production remained a fraction of American levels. Speer's achievement was maintaining any production at all while under sustained bombing, but he couldn't match an enemy whose factories operated without disruption. Japanese production faced compounding crises. Raw material shortages, shipping losses, bombing, and industrial inefficiency created a death spiral where each problem made others worse. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had collapsed not because factories were destroyed, but because aluminum, engines, and skilled workers weren't available. The ships needed to import materials had been sunk. The factories producing components had been bombed. The workers had been conscripted or killed. The Italian industrial base was never competitive. Italian production, even before joining the war, was a fraction of major powers. After joining, it faced material shortages, technological backwardness, and strategic bombing that crippled even limited output. Italy's surrender in 1943 removed its contribution entirely, making the Axis industrial base even weaker relative to American production. The strategic implications of American production superiority were decisive. By 1944, American forces could afford tactics that would have been impossible for Axis forces. Artillery fire could be called liberally because ammunition was abundant. Air support was available because aircraft and pilots were plentiful. Damaged equipment could be replaced because production exceeded losses. The material advantage created operational flexibility that translated directly to tactical success. German generals after the war often blamed their defeat on being outnumbered and outproduced. This was accurate but incomplete. They had started the war knowing America's industrial potential. Hitler had declared war on the United States unnecessarily after Pearl Harbor. The strategic decision to fight enemies with overwhelming production advantages was German choice. Losing the production war wasn't bad luck. It was foreseeable consequence of fighting America. Japanese planners were more realistic about production disparities but miscalculated American will. They believed America would negotiate after suffering casualties, that industrial capacity wouldn't matter if Americans weren't willing to use it. This miscalculation was catastrophic. American industrial capacity combined with determination created the material avalanche that destroyed Japan's military and economy. The human cost of American production was far lower than combat casualties, but still significant. Industrial accidents killed thousands of workers. Health effects from chemical exposure, particularly in explosive and synthetic rubber production, affected workers for decades. The workforce expansion brought women and minorities into industrial work, advancing social change, but also revealing how far from equality American society remained. The post-war implications were profound. American industry's production capability, once directed toward military goods, could be redirected toward civilian prosperity. The factories that built tanks could build automobiles. The shipyards that built Liberty ships could build merchant vessels. The workforce skills developed during wartime transferred to peacetime manufacturing. American industrial dominance during the war translated into economic dominance afterward. The final accounting shows the scale starkly. The United States produced 300,000 aircraft, all types, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 12,000 major warships, 8 million tons of shipping, 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 1 billion artillery rounds, 5 million tons of bombs. This exceeded total Axis production across every category. In some categories, American production was double Axis production. In others, it was 5 or 10 times greater. The disparity wasn't marginal, it was overwhelming, and it was decisive. Yamamoto's prediction was accurate. America had awakened, and its industrial capacity had become a terrible weapon. By 1944, the mathematical inevitability he had foreseen was apparent. Axis forces faced enemies who could replace every loss, supply every need, and sustain operations indefinitely. The Axis couldn't match this, couldn't counter it, couldn't survive it. The lesson was clear. In industrial-age warfare, production capacity determines outcomes as much as tactics or technology. Germany had better tanks and Japan had better pilots, but neither mattered against an enemy who could produce adequate equipment in unlimited quantities. American industry didn't win the war alone. Courage, tactics, and strategy all mattered. But American production made victory possible and made it inevitable once industrial capacity was fully mobilized. When the war ended, American factories had proven that industrial capitalism, when focused toward a clear goal, could produce at scales totalitarian systems couldn't match. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a slogan. It was an accurate description of how American industrial capacity, converted to military production, had buried the Axis under an avalanche of materiel that no amount of courage or skill could overcome.